Next up, we have the Team Green. Coming on, give them a hand.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Gargana. We're Team Green, and we're excited to get started. All right, so we'll briefly go over problem overview, our solution methodology and approach, and then we'll end with Q&A. All right, so as you've heard, we're working with Ben Murphy and Daughters Building Supply, and they're facing this wonderful problem of increasing demand across the Southeast. Unfortunately, this may lead to some strain in maintaining a high service level. So we want to make sure that we're upholding product quality and consumer expectations, and that was our objective as a group, to make sure that we're providing high-value products to a growing consumer base while minimizing the shipping time. All right, so we did this by analyzing their supply chain first to see where we had room for growth and where we had value add. So this started with Shanghai, which will most likely remain constant, although we did allow some consideration for potential demand shifts towards products made in the United States. From there, we analyzed the port, which is currently Charleston and facing a little bit of a bottleneck situation. So we did look into other ports and expanding. We also looked at distribution centers, and we did this using a variable cost model, and we'll go into that in more depth later. And of course, the end customer was always our priority. So I'm going to hand it off to Marlene to talk more about that.
Thanks, Georgiana. So to make our warehouse placement decisions, we focused on 3 different markets. The first one was the building materials market. Then, because we have the wood and stone products, the second one, the warehousing market. We want to place our warehouses in strategic locations. And the third one, the trucking market. We want to take our products from one way to the other, but in the minimum cost possible. So going deep into the markets, we consider 2 factors per each one. For building materials, we consider average household wealth and new construction activities. For warehousing material, we consider real estate costs, effective rent per square per foot, and we consider the energy costs for last year. And also for trucking market, we consider the trucking capacity and the average risk. Since we didn't have any information about the insurance premium, we focused on the report accidental from last year, and we assume that the higher the accidental report, the higher it will be the insurance premium. So here we can see some examples of the visualizations we use in Sonar. At the left, we use the warehousing rent effectives. We can see all the states, and it will take us the rent per square per foot. And at the right, we can see the median household income per state. I will now leave you with Shave.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marlene. So as we can see here, we've jotted down all 6 of the metrics that we'd used, Marlene mentioned earlier. The metrics that we built a model that basically takes into account all of these metrics and sort of spits out a ranking. We assigned different weights to different metrics based on the importance that we thought. We assigned the highest weight to the effective rate, because since we considered that to be the main stake of our operations, we wanted to minimize the cost. And the second factor that we assigned the highest weight to was the accidents, because we wanted to minimize the risk. So lower accidents leads to a higher ranking, and that spits out the value on the right side. As you can see, Dallas-Fort Worth has the highest value. However, we decided not to include that in as our warehouse because it is the furthest away from our current base of operations and from our demand. So that the next best option was Atlanta, Georgia, since they have a relatively low effective rent and they have relatively low accidents. So this solves our problem very effectively, since it's right there as our hub already. It's also contacting all of the Southeast markets, and therefore it eliminates the need for Nashville, Chattanooga, Charlotte, Knoxville, and Greenville, South Carolina. And then Tampa, Florida is too far away from the rest of our operations and can be fulfilled from Atlanta, since it's under 450 miles. And same goes for Tulsa and Columbus, Ohio. Therefore, we were left with Richmond, Virginia, which is an effective player, slightly moving up northeast, allowing us to tackle some more markets over there, and Memphis, Tennessee, which is more centrally placed in Tennessee, allowing us to attack the Arkansas markets as well as Kentucky markets. Moving on. I'll pass it on to Seth.
Great. Thanks, Shave. So next, we're going to look at phase 1 of our rollout plan for how we are going to go about this expansion. So step 1, we're simply going to expand operations in Atlanta. Atlanta is a prime location. As we saw when we inputted the data into our model, it came out the top of the list, which makes intuitive sense, and it's great because we already have operations there, so we're simply going to grow those operations. The next step is we're going to add a new port in New Orleans. So as we know, Charleston is congested. To alleviate some of that congestion, we're going to add a new port in New Orleans to also help address fulfillment of Atlanta and also address new markets. We'll talk about that in a second. Next step is to add our 2 new warehouses in Memphis and Richmond. So Memphis will be addressed by New Orleans, Richmond will be addressed by Charleston, and Atlanta will be fulfilled rather by both. Next step. So when we're looking at Youngstown and Dallas, so those were unique markets because of the recent e-commerce spike. Right, so we definitely want to address those, but it's recent, so we're unsure if that'll be a sustained business line, right? We don't know how sustainable that line of revenue will be, so we don't want to establish a permanent warehouse there just yet. So first of all, we're going to outsource our transportation to Dallas and Youngstown with third-party logistics providers. But once we get there, because it's e-commerce, there's a high premium on getting the product to the customer's doorstep in a faster, much shorter timeline. So we need to store material there. Basically, we're going to leverage flexible warehousing solutions. There's some emerging startups, such as Stored here, as well as Flex. That allows us to take advantage of excess capacity in some warehouses that are already there, to store material there, and get it to the customer even faster. So that is phase 1. So then we started talking about, do we want to keep our headquarters in Chattanooga? We ended up with an emphatic yes. Due to geography. Hey, best city in the world, right? So geography, central location, near all of our primary customers, great for customer success and customer service relations. Number 2, easily accessible talent pool. As we know, there are a lot of millennials, college graduates moving to Chattanooga in the past 5 years or so. Great talent pool. Low cost, much lower cost of living than Atlanta. Again, great for talent. Biggest one, freight industry ecosystem. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk this weekend. We have some market leaders such as US Express and Covenant Transport here to tap into that expertise and that network, as well as startups like Workhound. So again, company culture is really important. We need to understand the driver and the driver of the truck and understand the problems they face day to day. Workhound is a startup that helps have transparency into drivers' experience as an employee and helps increase worker retention. So that's another big value add of having it in Chattanooga, where the company culture around freight is very, very good. So next, I'm going to pass on to Sajana.
Thank you, Sims. So looking at phase 2 of our growth strategy, it is important to realize that we need to see the changes in the market trends. And after seeing how the third-party logistics plays in Dallas, we decided to convert it into a company-owned distribution center depending on the demand pattern seen for 2 years. Further, we want to consolidate not only the southeastern footprint for America, we also want to consolidate the entire North American footprint for our client. One way we see to do this is to open a new port in Canada, Prince Rupert, and we chose this because of various favorable factors. With the opening of this port, we would also see a new mode of transportation, intermodal rail transportation, and an opening of a DC in Chicago. Why choose rail? Cost savings, energy savings, as well as a less business risk of price and variance, price and capacity variance. I'll hand it over to Shaiv to go over the opportunities.
Thank you. So moving on, watching our opportunities, we look at the overarching supply chain as a whole once again. The first part of our supply chain deals with the production. Production is currently in Shanghai, which is great. However, there is a possibility to move production to the southeast as well in the future. This is more of a very long-term solution, but it will lead to reduction in a lot of logistics costs and will also give us the stamp of made in the United States, which is a huge marketing push. The second and a most important recommendation is for Ben Murphy and Daughters to actually diversify their product offerings in the sense that we would recommend that they expand their fleet and venture into the market of not only wholesale construction material supply, but also logistics, like a dedicated logistics service providing. This basically stems from the idea that the construction market is very volatile and the freight market is not so much, and we've noticed recent trends that the freight market is only due to rise. So this essentially pools our variability and diversifies our risk. Also, we wanted to emphasize on reducing empty miles since we have multiple freight hubs. And our freight hubs, the way we've done the computations, they essentially run within 450 miles. All of our clients are sourced within 450 miles of at least one of our freight hubs. The next thing is the integrated technology. We want to use ERP systems to sort of make sure that the hubs are communicating across different points in the supply chain. Also, we would like to use Convoy, which is a software that will allow us to sort of monitor our supply chain and optimize our routes better. And then finally, this will lead to reduction of energy and consumption and costs by using techniques such as rail, since 1 ton of freight can be transported 400 miles by rail on 1 gallon of fuel as opposed to trucks. Finally, we identified some key challenges that come around with our suggestions. And first and foremost was the government legislation, since the port at Prince Rupert would be in Canada. We determined that if the costs are too large, we'd consider using the port in Stockton in California instead. If the port of New Orleans, if the risk in terms of weather was too high, we would consider moving it to the port at Houston instead. If the weather conditions in the north and northeast, since we're not very well equipped, since we've been working in the southeast corridor, were not favorable, we would use third-party logistics and storage services until we were able to develop technical competencies to deal with these issues. Finally, since insurance and compliance-related risks with expansions are huge, we considered foreign trade zone benefits for all of our ports, and all of the new warehouse locations we decided were placed in high-volume freight locations, since they were well equipped to deal with these new expansions. Finally, so since we knew that at any new distribution center locations there will always be unused capacity, we decided to first pilot the project by using a third-party freight supplier, and that would basically give us an idea of when we could actually physically shift our distribution center there so as to tackle that market. Thank you. I will take any questions now.
Great presentation, guys. I have a question. Did you guys create an index on your own? No. So this warehouse sentiment or placement index, is that? You had a slide where you had weighted a bunch of factors.
Yeah.
Yeah, we ranked the locations, the top locations with all the warehouse based on the few different factors.
But you could turn that into an index as those things fluctuate, right? I like it. All right, good job. We like indexes around here. Daniel Pickett wants to meet with whomever designed this for a data science role. I liked it. It was a good job.
Thank you.
And good presentation. I do have a couple of questions that I want clarity. You are maintaining Atlanta?
Yes.
All right, okay. Just want to make sure.
Number one choice, right there.
All right. And why do you want to maintain Atlanta?
So since it's definitely the highest ranking right there, but at the same time, it's a high traffic zone, and it's very centrally located within the southeast, so it's got sort of very strategic position in terms of location distances to our clients. It's within, if we were to look at our clients, I can show it to you right there. So from Atlanta, Charlotte, Richmond, and like areas between Memphis and Atlanta, and even Florida, Tampa, Florida, they're all within a 450-mile radius. So our current existing customers can be fulfilled using just the Atlanta DC. However, for the further reaching ones, such as the ones in Gilbertsville, Kentucky, we require Memphis, such as the one in Dallas, we require Memphis. And for the ones in Washington, DC, and in Youngstown, we require Richmond. So we basically wanted to cover all our bases in tackling all of our clients.
Got it. I have two questions for you. You made a comment that the freight market is not volatile. How did you draw that conclusion?
Well, when I meant to say not volatile, we meant to say that there's always going to be a need for freight. I essentially meant that, like, since we noticed that the future trends show a lot more increase in the requirements for freight across the United States. That's essentially what we meant. We meant to like diversify sort of only construction equipment as opposed to like two different services. That would be another stream of revenue.
And you feel like construction is less volatile or more volatile than trucking?
Yes.
Okay. I suppose just curious.
We actually saw one of the indexes on Sonar, and it was about the transportation of construction materials and the seasonal demand of that. So we saw that there was a seasonal nature in the data that was provided, and we thought that maybe by diversifying our business, like Shaiv mentioned, we would be able to look at off-season revenue streams.
Interesting. All right, I want to ask a question, and I'm completely being theoretical. If we had a situation where the U.S. government could ever shut down, what's going to happen to your Canada port when you can't get across border?
Right, so...
Not that that would ever happen.
Right. But in case of that contingency is why we had the idea of having the Stockton port in California instead, Northern California. If that port were to not work, we would probably essentially consider not having it. If the legislative costs of like establishing that port were too high, we would just consider one of the ports along the west coast of the United States instead.
And what would you do in a situation where it was a disruption of sorts, and it happened suddenly, how your product would be in Canada, would it not?
Right. Temporarily, I assume we would obviously overload our ports in Charleston. And by 2022, Charleston also has promised to have barges in bay, which means basically they'll be holding a lot of the storage on site at the port itself, but not physically on land. So that will increase their capacity. But at the same time, we'll also have the New Orleans port. So we will be able to tackle our requirements. However, this will definitely be like an issue. Maybe we can consider opening up another port along the Western Corridor and transferring those products from Canada to the United States.
Is that a free trade zone?
I believe all the ones in the United States that we picked were.
In Port, is it Port Rupert? Is that right?
Port of Prince Rupert.
Sorry, Prince Rupert. Is it free trade zone, or?
We believe so, but not 100% sure about it. We'll check about that.
I don't know the answer, so I'm just curious if you did.
What was the integrated technology you guys said you're going to implement?
Right.
On that last slide, I think.
So, yeah, essentially we wanted to tackle using ERP systems. We wanted to have all of our nodes communicating with each other. That was the one way to sort of get the supply chain very streamlined. And the other thing was to use Convoy, which is a route optimization software.
Awesome. No, yeah, that's it.
Okay, give me one word to sum up your team dynamics. You can't answer it. One of them answers.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I would say our team dynamics has been so comprehensive, at least for me. I am not from here, and like they has been so nice to explain me like everything, every word that I cannot understand, every meaning. They has been so nice. So I really will say like it will be comprehensive. Do you want to add up?
Can you guys walk me through a little bit the Chicago hub? How did you guys came up with that recommendation? I don't think I followed that.
Yeah, so basically, if we want to go back, so when we introduce the Prince Rupert port, the most cost-effective route would be to take it to Chicago, and then Chicago would also be another great distribution center. And then, obviously, this is in phase 2, so it's further down the line. But once we've established ourselves in a broader radius in the southeastern market, we can start to expand to the northeast, and Chicago offers a fantastic opportunity to start the expansion in the northeast and Midwest.
And so would you keep Richmond, for example, if you had the Chicago hub?
That's a great question. I think that's something we'd have to evaluate with more data. That'd be something we have to evaluate, but I think the distance is large enough to where if Richmond continued to address maybe the northeast and Chicago more the Midwest, but that would be something we'd have to evaluate given more data.
And so again, when you're placing the warehouses, one of the biggest assumptions, what can you reach within 450 miles? Was that the thinking?
Yeah, so a 450-mile radius from all of our distribution centers, one of our main concerns was about the driver, right? They have 11 hours. That's as long as they can drive, and we want them to get there, take their load, and then be able to get home. That cuts costs for the company because they're not staying somewhere else. That also just increases morale, right? I mean, the driver's got to get back to the family. And that's something that we really took seriously, and we wanted to be able to address that. And then outside the 450-mile radius from these distribution centers, we want to emphasize that we're leveraging third-party logistics providers and flexible warehousing to be able to scale up and scale down on demand, depending on fluctuations in the market.
Thank you.
Great job, guys. I think you addressed a lot of issues that may not be explicitly stated in the case, but I think are relevant to a solution. One thing that you talked about was local sourcing for materials and thinking about moving some of that capacity to locally sourced materials as opposed to those coming from China. Any sense on what amount of capacity you think you could fill from locally sourced opportunities?
This was a very sort of not a short-term solution. We'd considered doing this in the very long term, like once we'd sort of fleshed out our plans for the markets currently as they were for the contracts, because since the company is very small right now, and it would be very difficult to source the material from within the US just about now. But in the future, maybe if the supply is large enough, we could definitely consider even 10, maybe 20% potentially.
No, great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's cool that you guys are staying in Atlanta. If I were picking this, and I know it's completely ambiguous, I would have gone down to Decatur just for the risk portion of that. But no, that's great. Something, I think Sims, you said it. It caught my ear. You said that you, in the future, may increase the private fleet and branch off as a separate revenue stream into 3PL. Can you explain, could the team explain reasoning there a little bit? Why move away from moving the commodities as opposed to then becoming the logistics party itself?
Absolutely. I think that you mentioned that. We can all speak to it.
So the idea was essentially since we already have like a pre-existing fleet, and we also have like the markets, right? We have like the construction markets for like high-end retail, high-end households and stuff. But eventually, what's going to happen is we might reach a point where this will all become sort of, it'll become like a well-oiled machine where it'll do its own thing. I think in the long run, we could potentially expand our own fleet and provide a separate line of services. So it's just running like logistics sourcing, so not necessarily only within the Southeast, but so for example, when a truck is going from Richmond to Richmond to Washington, D.C., or Richmond to sort of even Youngstown. So Youngstown currently would be served by third party, but if later on we were to consider turning Dallas into a full-scale D.C., going from Dallas further out or New Orleans to Dallas could return somewhere else within the Southeast corridor with some other company's material as on contract basis.
I'll add some to that. So something we really wanted to consider, because at scale, we wanted to eliminate backhaul and deadheading with an empty truck, right? So if these trucks are going to the outer radius of 450 miles, and they're coming back with an empty truck, that's a huge cost right there. That at scale, if we can become not just a wholesaler provider of building materials, but become a third-party logistics provider, we can then acquire a new load at the end location and have a full load the whole time. So that decreases or increases efficiency and productivity. It makes a whole lot of sense because it'd be silly to be driving an empty truck if you have a scale and you have a network that we built over this two-phase plan to then take advantage of that.
So could I then follow up with that and ask, what do you think are going to be your impacts on operational risk?
Wait, say that again?
What are going to be your impacts or the effects on your operational risk?
Operational risk, yeah, great question. So with increased scale, there's obviously going to be increased risk, like you were saying. So there are a couple services we'd love to leverage. Software platforms at scale, Verisk, Omnitrax, all great risk management solution providers for the freight market. And as we get to scale, we can start to implement those and scale intelligently. Like we said earlier, we're not scaling immediately. We're feeling out new markets with third-party logistics routes, flexible warehousing. If we feel like those will be sustainable markets, we then move into those and establish a permanent distribution center. So it's all very intentional and deliberate how we go about scaling in a slow but efficient way and maintaining risk management all the way through.
All right, cool, thank you.
Awesome. Great job. Thank you.